Okay, so I've got Blizzard Forum's MVP Doncroft here.
That's right.
Uh, yeah, and I'm of course Panera here. We're going to talk about some anatomy of Starcraft. So, was there a particular point you wanted to start with?
No, not at all. You go ahead and take it away.
Okay, well, one thing that we had discussed earlier, this is me and I can't remember his name. He sort of went before you earlier in the day. We were talking about the potential to form hybrids with Protoss and Zerg,
Hmm.
and some very interesting points actually came out of that. Primarily, the concept of a virus actually that is I was wrong in saying that it was an influenza. It's hepat hepat DNA or whatever virus. I'm not really into virology that much. Anyway, this paleo virus 19 million years ago inserted itself into the genome of the bird and has since gone extinct on its own. So this is a rather novel way of looking at perhaps how the Zerg go about doing these things, and the potential for like a Protoss to contribute its genetics in a way maybe a little bit more aggressively than what we see with something like the Queen.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's a really interesting concept that this fellow brought up. Actually, have you put any thought into something like this?
Well, the way I've always understood that Zerg mutation works is that the Zerg have a much more complex microcellular structure than we do. There are basically mutagens that constantly restructure their DNA. In other words, when our cells reproduce, as you know, they through mitosis they copy the DNA as perfectly as possible from one cell to the next.
Yeah.
But the process sometimes errors come up, which is one of the theories of what causes aging. Is that the series of errors that come up as the cells reproduce themselves is
Well,
what
actually,
causes.
aging is a combination of there's nonsense genes on either side of a gene or chromosome. There's nonsense material that
Hmm.
is called a telomere
Oh, I didn't know
that
that.
wears down over time. And recently, they've actually found that the same process that causes aging in infants actually carries forward throughout life. And if that could be stopped,
Oh.
hypothetically, that same process. Yeah, so it's not necessarily errors. Oftentimes, errors turn into things like severe errors can turn into things like cancer, which is a concern that had been brought up about the roach.
Yes, my information is based off of a science class that I recently taught in a high school.
Yeah, yeah.
I always pick up stuff from the material so whatever's being taught in that school at the time, that's what I pick up.
Oh,
So,
fair
because
enough.
I'm a
Yeah.
substitute teacher.
Okay.
But anyways, my original point was what the Zerg do is their DNA is constantly basically being overseen by these very small, I don't even know what to call them, like mutagens that are constantly working throughout the whole swarm. That they're all a network. It's probably through the creep, that through chemicals and stuff that they interchange information about the latest developments in the Zerg evolution. And I'm sure we'll see a lot of this when the Heart of the Swarm campaign is released, in terms of how the Zerg different strains evolve and change and advance and stuff. Basically, that process is going on at all times at a microscopic level. So which is why, and I was actually watching one of your videos, and you were talking about how the appearance has changed, like it's not always consistent of certain creatures in the StarCraft universe. And I was reading on one of the wikis last night, actually on my new iPod, and going over how the concept art and stuff has changed over time with something as simple as Zergling. Now, of course, the real explanation is that because different concept artists draw things differently. But if we're looking at it in a science fiction sense, even something as basic as a Zergling, which was originally based off of I believe it was called the Dune Runner.
Yeah, the runners of
That was the
some.
starting genome,
Yeah.
and they just keep evolving from that. So all these little changes from the head to the musculature of the legs, the form of the crest, all that stuff is constantly being changed. And I'm sure the overlords and the cerebrates or the queens, whoever's in charge, will be categorizing at a very advanced biological level the results of the battles from all these different strains, and they're seeing the performance of each individual like mutation of the Zergling. So it's like hyper-evolution going on at all times.
Yeah, it's basically a form of, well, what you could call unnatural selection, similar to what we did with dogs and cats. With you know how, like, obviously, like a bulldog doesn't look a whole lot like the original wolf that it came from.
No, not at all.
So yeah, so there is certain ways to do that, and if you were to, I mean, it's not inconceivable that they could do some advanced genetics. I mean, just recently, in fact, there was a synthetic genome that was created for a bacteria that was made basically of a patchwork of functional genes from various other bacteria, and this was inserted into the nucleus of living bacteria, and it actually got to the point where it was able to reproduce. So if we can do that, certainly something like the Zerg can. And I like that idea of this arms race where the Zerg are kind of constantly trying to stay ahead of the technologies and the strategies. And that's something that you actually see with the tech switch mechanic that is inherent in all the hives.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because
when you've got like a little hatchery, say, like a new fledgling hatchery, let's say, you know, the need arises for a ton of Zerglings on a new planet or whatever to just go out and explore. The need might not be there for a roach, right? So that's why they've divided up the. I know the larvae technically do have the genetics for all the strains. It's that the stimulus probably isn't there to produce the right unit. That's similar to how an ant forms into either a drone or a queen or the different castes. It's actually hormonal and nutrient based largely, more so than genetics.
Right. This is all going on through the creep. The creep is the messenger carrier, the blood vessels and everything of the Zerg hive. So, and as we know, like in StarCraft 2, in a perfect game, all the creep is connected. So every structure that's on that creep, that's that Zerg hive. So you notice how, like, at the beginning of a game, you've got the potential to build every unit type. They're all grayed out. So it's like in the DNA of every Zerg, there is the potential, the instruction for every strain available to the current Zerg swarm. However, it needs to develop the facilities biologically to actually create those strains. So it's all a process.
That's exactly what you see with when you have a brand new queen ant. And I harp on ants because I'm reading a fantastic book called Superorganism, which gives me a lot of strange looks because a quick glance, people often confuse it with superorgasm. Reading that on the bus is often quite led to a few interesting conversations. But anyway, this is a fantastic textbook about ants and superorganisms in general, which the Zerg absolutely are superorganisms. And that's basically a level of organization beyond an organism where you've got things working so eusocially and so altruistically that they function as one. So you get this new queen. She can't, let's say we're talking about one of the advanced types of ant, like the leafcutter, which has hundreds maybe of different castes and subcastes, and perhaps like 500 million members per colony. When she starts off a new colony, she can only make, you know, a couple rounds of drones, if you will. And from there, it kind of escalates based on, okay, well, now we need the heavy hitters to come down and cut the leaves. And now we need the soldiers to defend ourselves from impending assault and things like that as need arises.
And don't they communicate that based on pheromones?
They do. There's also, I was just reading this the other day. They do pheromones. They've actually repurposed their anus, which we all know that the Zerg have done. The celebrated anus, as I've pointed out in this series. They actually use a series of glands on their abdomen to lay out almost like pheromone highways. And they also use a sort of ritualistic, they kind of will like go up and bite each other or like touch each other in a certain way. And that's how the initial recruitment happens. And then they follow through with the pheromones. So this sort of could be done with sound or anything like that, maybe from an overlord or whatever. So it's actually quite an advanced thing. I try to avoid psionics.
Now, I'm going to bring us back to one of our more original points and approach it from a literature perspective, because that's my main field of study, literature. and the understanding of literary connections in terms of themes and stuff. Basically, you started this interview talking about the Protoss-Zerg hybrids. I'm going to approach that from a literary standpoint because I think that's what I'm most capable of. I watched your video recently on the Protoss anatomy and how boring it was, and I do agree from a scientific standpoint it is, but you have to understand that Starcraft is essentially, when it comes to campaign, the lore, it is a piece of literature. And literature will follow certain themes. And I've been following the literature of StarCraft since, when I started looking at it, it was like 2001, I believe. And it always enchanted me, especially the original campaigns, the original StarCraft. I mean, we had awesome voice acting and really good writing. Like Chris Metzen and his team, they really nailed it back then. And frankly, I still think they've got the capacity to nail it in the upcoming expansion. But back to my point. The Zerg are very scientifically themed, very scientific. They're, which is why I think they hit in your area of paleontology and biology so well, because they're all biologically themed. The theme of evolution, the theme of survival, the theme just everything.
Competition.
They're growing, they're conquering. They're surviving. They're the fittest race. They're the purity of the essence, I believe. And the essence of a true champion race is the ability to adapt and survive, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, let's contrast the Protoss. From a literary standpoint, the Protoss are a race that, whether you believe in magic or not, that is their theme. They are a mythical race. They are a race of supermen. While they may have advanced technology, you notice how little of their technology is actually explained lore-wise. That's because thematically, it's not as important. You've got things that are usually associated with either magic or, some kind of fiction. You've got telepathy. You've got melding, like the two High Templar coming together. That's due to the old literary concept of soul binding. The power of bringing two entities together. Their psionics, the fact that they don't leave bodies when they die, and now there's some different theories about that. Are they being warped back? Do they actually turn into energy? The fact that they've got no mouth. The fact that their eyes always glow so mystically, and we have no explanation for why there's different colors. Glowing.
Well, the reason why the eyes glow is there's something called the tapetum lucidum, which if you ever take a flashlight and flash it on like a cat's eyes, basically that is a layer of reflective material that reflects the light back so that the retina can hit it again or see it again, and that allows for better night vision.
But the Protoss are producing. Their eyes actually glow. You can tell from the cinematics and stuff that their eyes are actually producing light. And what I'm saying is you've got this theme, and let's talk about the Protoss culture for a second, if you don't mind. The Protoss culture was always very prolific. Like unless with the exception of the Templar, they're based on belief. So not just mysticism, but religion as well. Okay? This is the way certain things are done. They don't need to explain it. They just believe it. And it's worked for thousands of years. Now, all of a sudden, what do they come face-to-face with? The Zerg Swarm.
Which is the antithesis of sort of what they've been.
Exactly. And it's shattered their culture. Does it mean they were wrong? No, not necessarily. But it means that they have to acknowledge the fact that despite them having these belief systems that have kept them together, given them unity, given them strength, that their technology was unparalleled, unrivaled, that their warriors train for decades all these martial arts and using this advanced technology to have unmatched prowess in battle, and they can be torn apart by a creature that is birthed from an egg minutes before.
And it's also mass-produced, too.
And
so
it's
instead
mass-produced.
of
With
so instead of
no training, nothing. Yeah.
Yeah, instead of the 10 decades or whatever of pure training and meditation and preparation and technology, it's, here's 500,000 Zerglings suddenly at your doorstep.
Right.
And it's like the sheer... And then you get the Terran involved in that, too, where the Terran are kind of... They're almost like they're trying to be a Protoss kind of thing with the technology and the morals and ethics and things?
If we want to bring in the Terran, I can tell you flat out what the Terrans represent. They represent freedom. They do. If you look at the Terrans from a literary standpoint, you're always seeing two things: freedom and tyranny, control, free choice, constantly contrasted between the Terrans. You've got the UED, which is all about organization, subjugation, control.
Yes.
They wanted to come in Brood War. They wanted to come into the Koprulu sector, and they wanted to subjugate the Protoss, subjugate the Dominion, and completely subjugate the Zerg to the point where they can take this advanced biological race and turn it into a tool in the name of humanity.
Yeah, with the psi emitters or whatever.
But you see, the Terrans' very existence in the Koprulu sector is an expression of freedom. The fact that they don't belong here. They're not native to this sector at all. And
they weren't engineered either.
No, and they really had no true reason to be there. It's hostile. Life there is difficult. It's not very forgiving to the Terran way of life, but they're there anyways. They are there in defiance of everything natural.
It kind of reminds me of the moment in South Park where Randy Marsh throws his shirt off after drinking a bunch of beer at a kid's baseball game and say, "Standing right here, what are you going to do about it?"
Interesting.
I just have that image in my head.
That's literature. Certain things will conjure certain things. That literature is very associative. So,
and what's interesting is you can actually take a look at the Protoss as well from a scientific standpoint, as far as their anatomy and how they work, and that is actually they're much more of a. I mean, with the whole Templar cast and getting rid of the Dark Templars and all that, they very much so represent that pure kind of. I really hate to make this logical fallacy, but it's almost kind of like what Hitler had dreamed of with purity of whatever you're trying to do.
Yes, the Aryan race. The Aryan race.
And purity of principle, and everyone unified under this banner. And in contrast, you have Zerg, which is taking bits and pieces from absolutely anything they can get their paws on that they find useful.
Anything that works.
Yes, and they twist it and make it work. In fact, one could argue that the species that the Zerg have encountered, that the Zerg have found use for, are more successful than they would be without the Zerg. So in a way, genetically speaking, from a species standpoint, a huge favor that the Zerg could do to the Protoss is to hijack their genetics and twist them into these hybrids, because the Protoss are going extinct.
Glad we're back to that point, because now when it comes to the Protoss Zerg hybrids, we still don't know exactly why the Zerg cannot just flat out infest a Protoss. Why can't they grab a Protoss in their goo and turn them into an infested Protoss? They do it with Terrans all the time. With great ease. All they need to do is get the Zerg virus in them, and when in a matter of hours, there's different figures on that, but it does not take long. It's basically up to the Zerg mutagen how fast it wants to move. If it wants to hide itself or not. Go ahead.
You could actually look at it more like a cordyceps fungus, which is where that actually takes over the mind and the body of. There's several other parasitoids as well that do things like horsehair worms, compel crickets to jump into water and swim 6 feet out before they emerge from the celebrated anus, of all things. So it's more likely some sort of a parasite. I believe that's what the original Zerg was a parasite that's now turned into repurposed for the larvae. But it's a good point. Why can't the Zerg simply infest Protoss? And if it has anything to do with psionics, how were they able to do that with Kerrigan?
Yeah, exactly. And now here comes a little bit of a gripe I have between the lore of the original StarCraft and the lore of StarCraft 2. I was quite unhappy when they announced the Protoss being photosynthetic. I did not think, first of all, that would imply that they would be green. Because as far as we know, like chloroplasts always.
Well, not necessarily.
Not necessarily, I know.
There's some blue-green algae as well as red. It just depends on the wavelength of light that you're using.
True.
So there is some capacity for.
But I thought that took some of the mythical element, the thematic mythical element, out of the Protoss, and it just doesn't fit. It doesn't fit.
I think
Star
that
Wars,
was the reason why they did that.
I'm going to bring up
because,
Star Wars fans. Star Wars fans
okay.
have a similar gripe when Star Wars Episode 1 came out, and they talked about the midichlorians. Are you familiar with that? Like the microscopic life forms living in your blood that provide the connection to the Force. Fans were unhappy with that because it took a mythical element out, whereas, the Force in Star Wars was always a mythical element. That's kind of the same feeling I got with the photosynthetic announcement. Now, I believe we've rolled with it, and it's all right because they're still absorbing energy into a being that doesn't. I mean, they've got a musculature much like a mammal.
Maybe some wrap-up points.
Okay,
And then for the next,
fast wrap-up. What I was getting to.
Yeah.
The Protoss-Zerg hybrids, thematically, from a point of literature, they symbolize a forced unification between this kind of prolific magical religion establishment and this, all holds barred adaptability, power, survivability. You mesh them together, and what you have is a symbol of no choice, a lack of freedom. Kind of anti-Terran spirit, kind of anti-Jim Raynor almost, to the greatest extent, because the hybrids are completely forced. They are by design, but they are, in essence, chaotic, because you have two things that normally wouldn't go together, forced together into something